the other two Ben Franklin videos where we've been studying thought groups, we've been looking at speeches that people were giving to a group of people. So prepared text, practiced text, and then the people were speaking into a microphone, talking to a whole room of people. That's really different than conversational English. So it's interesting to study thought groups there, but it's also important to take a look at how we use thought groups in conversation. So I have this footage of me and my dad talking with my uncle about his boat. And what I found is that we use thought groups differently when we're speaking conversational English. First of all, they tend to be longer than they were in the TED Talks videos. Why? Because if you're speaking to a group of people into a microphone, it's a little bit artificial. Some of the people are very far away, so you're more likely to put in more gaps for understandability. Now, when you're just in conversation a couple feet away from somebody, you don't need to put in as many gaps, as many breaks, in order for the person who's listening to keep up with you. What I found is that we tend to use gaps more when we're trying to think of a word or when we're trying to think of how to explain something. Now, this doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen some of the time. And then within the thought groups, of course, everything is linked together. So let's take a look at a little bit of this conversation with my Uncle Frank.
Well, on the top of the fuel tank, which is in the bottom of the boat, there's a...
So there, he's starting his story. He says, well, on the top of the fuel tank. So this is just, the word "the" here is just a filler word that he uses as he's thinking, okay, wait, how exactly am I going to describe this? He thought he was going to talk about the fuel tank, but instead he went in to say, on the top of the fuel tank. So there is a break here as he was thinking about how exactly to describe the object he was talking about.
Well, on the top of the fuel tank, which is in the bottom of the boat, there's a...
Which is in the bottom of the boat. So there's another little break here. And again, I think this was just as he was thinking exactly what to say about it, which is in the bottom of the boat, which is quick thought happening. What do I want to say about where it's located? What do I want to tell them about this fuel tank? Okay, he'll tell us it's in the bottom of the boat.
Which is in the bottom of the boat, there's a round thing.
Another pause here. There's a round thing. There's a round thing. Again, this happened as he was thinking, how do I describe this thing? So he's decided to use the word round. There's a round thing.
There's a round thing about this big that bolts on the top of the fuel tank, and in the middle of that is where the gas goes in.
Okay, so he says, and in the middle of that, pauses, there's, pause, is where the gas goes in. So again, he is thinking about how to say what he's saying. He starts with the word there's, thinks again, and decides to say, is where. These breaks here happened as he was thinking about how to describe this part of the boat. Neither myself nor my dad know very much about boats. He knew that as he was describing it. Now, other than that, when he was thinking here about how to describe this next part, there was a pretty long thought group here between round and that. While he didn't need to think about what to say, he knew exactly how he wanted to describe it, so the words came out quickly with no breaks. Let's listen to that long thought group again.
Round thing about this big that bolts on the top of the fuel tank, and in the middle of that, there's...
And then he gets to the point where he's not sure how to describe the next thing, so there are a couple little breaks as he's thinking about it.
And in the middle of that, is where the gas goes in.
Okay, so he finishes his sentence, is where the gas goes in. He puts a little natural pause there between thoughts. This is where the gas goes in. Now he's getting ready to talk about the air vent, so there's a natural little break in conversation there.
And in the middle of that, is where the gas goes in, and there's an air vent for the air to come out as the gas is going in. There's also a sending unit to tell you how much fuel's in there.
Then he has a really long thought group again, and I think he unconsciously puts a little break here in after unit, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he had just spoken for so long without a thought group break that as a native speaker, without knowing it, he sensed that he needed to put a little break there in order for us to keep up with him. Because if, as a native speaker, you never put in any thought groups, you never put in any breaks, it gets very hard and tiresome to listen to that. So even though he does not need to stop to think about the right word to say, and even though it's not a big sentence break, it's not necessarily grammatically very clear that you would have to put a thought group here, he does put a little break here. Just because natural conversation needs these little breaks. Let's listen again to that long thought group.
And in the middle of that, is where the gas goes in, and there's an air vent for the air to come out as the gas is going in. There's also a sending unit to tell you how much fuel's in there.
So that was a lot. You can see how if he just kept going and going like that for 10, 20, 30 seconds, it would be very challenging to listen, to focus, to keep up with that. These little tiny breaks that separate the thought groups just give the brain time to relax while listening to speech, even as a native speaker.
Is where the gas goes in, and there's an air vent for the air to come out as the gas is going in. There's also a sending unit to tell you how much fuel's in there. And while the tank is made of aluminum, this top...
So this little thought group here, and he separates out and. I think he probably did this because he was thinking of how exactly to describe the next thing.
And while the tank is made of aluminum, this top I don't think is.
He puts a little break here after top. He adds an interjection, I don't think. I don't think it is.
This top I don't think is. And it's rusted and it's corroded.
Okay. And it's rusted and it's corroded. Maybe not a full break here, a little lift though, a little mini separation. And it's rusted and it's corroded. He's listing things. He's repeating the first two words of the sentence. It's natural there to put a little break to separate that repetition.
This top I don't think is. And it's rusted and it's corroded.
Okay.
And so what happens...
Sort of a longer break, probably thinking about how to describe what happens to the boat in this situation.
And so what happens is if we don't run the bilge pump often enough, or if it gets too full of water, water comes over the top of the tank.
This break between the word water and the other word water is a very natural place to put a break in conversation. If this, then this. So in an if-then statement, if we don't know what to do, how can we figure out the next step? For example, it's very, very normal in conversation to put a little break after an if statement before the then statement. Now he leaves out the word then here, but it would grammatically work. It works grammatically without it. But that's just something to think about. If this, break, then this.
If we don't run the bilge pump often enough, or if it gets too full of water, water comes over the top of the tank, and normally it wouldn't be a problem, but since this is so rusty, we think water goes down in there and you get scum in the tank. And
okay, so he follows the thought group break between water with two really long thought groups. He knows what he wants to say. He doesn't have to stop and think. Notice that he then puts a break and says and another break next. Here he's clearly thinking about what next to say about it. But between water up here and all the way down here at tank, he doesn't have to stop and think of the words. So he doesn't put in very many thought groups, just one little break here after rusty.
Since this is so rusty, we think water goes down in there and you get scum in the tank. And apparently the water and the scum floats on top of the fuel. And all week we were fine.
Here he's putting in more thought groups where we would grammatically write a sentence ending, a period. So here the pace is a little bit easier to follow, putting in a few more thought groups.
And all week we were fine, but as the fuel level went down, Friday I hadn't put any fuel in it, Dale goes out there with his family the past 2 years on Friday and has a lot of fun, and all of a sudden it starts cutting out.
Yeah. I think I hear another little break here. So again, he's not looking for words. He's not trying to think about how to describe this. I don't think there are pauses for thinking. I think all of these pauses are just naturally made in order to break up into thought groups what he's saying for understandability.
And when the gas gets so low, I think it starts sucking the water and the gunk.
Yeah.
So this year, to avoid that, I went in the middle of the week and filled it up again.
Okay. He even did another little tiny break there. So this phrase he says with no break in thought group. So here I'm responding with yeah. So it's getting a little bit more conversational rather than him telling a whole story with no comments. I'm putting in these little comments. Yeah. Yeah. When he's breaking for a thought group. This is a very natural part of conversation as well. If someone is telling a long story and you're listening to it, it's very natural and normal to throw in yeah and mm-hmm and oh really. As they're breaking their speech into thought groups, you're putting in these little responses to show that you're listening, that you understand, that you follow what they're saying. So here, as I'm adding yeah, it breaks up his speech naturally into these smaller thought groups because as he's putting in a little break, I'm responding. So that breaks up his speech even more with an even longer thought group. If I hadn't responded, he probably would have kept on going here. But he put in a little tiny break, and I went ahead and used that as an opportunity to say, I'm listening to you. Now, all of this is stuff we're doing without thinking about, of course.
So this year, to avoid that, I went in the middle of the week and filled it up again.
Okay. Now here in this little chunk of speech, he was maybe thinking a little bit about what to say, but it also may have just been little natural breaks for understandability.
So it's still got, and I kind of hate that because there's a half tank gas in here.
Yeah.
And if nobody uses it, the gas won't be that good next year.
Yeah. And one little, very slight break here, maybe even if I was marking it again, I maybe wouldn't even put a break there. But just a little lift here. And then in the next chunk, no lifts at all one thought group.
And if nobody uses it, the gas won't be that good next year.
So what can we learn from what we've studied here? In conversational English, often when people put in breaks, it's because they're thinking of how exactly to describe something. Not always, but often. And sometimes speakers put in breaks naturally without thinking about it to improve understandability. And in a few of these thought groups that were very long, we saw that if the speaker didn't put in breaks and just kept going and going and going, it would be very hard to sit and listen to, even for a native speaker. These little breaks are what make it easy to listen to somebody, relaxing to engage in conversation. What makes the breaks? One of the things that makes the breaks is the contrast between these little breaks between speech and all of the connected speech within a thought group. So both of these are important. Putting in the breaks for understandability and then connecting all of your words within a thought group. That is also important for the character of American English. That also helps a native listener feel relaxed when hearing someone speak. If every word is choppy, then the groups become less clear and it becomes less easy to listen and understand. Let's listen to the whole conversation one more time.
Well, on the top of the fuel tank, which is in the bottom of the boat, there's a round thing about this big that bolts on the top of the fuel tank, and in the middle of that is where the gas goes in, and there's an air vent for the air to come out as the gas is going in. There's also a sending unit to tell you how much fuel's in there. And while the tank is made of aluminum, this top I don't think is, and it's rusted and it's corroded.
Okay.
And so what happens is if we don't run the bilge pump often enough, or if it gets too full of water, water comes over the top of the tank, and normally it wouldn't be a problem, but since this is so rusty, we think water goes down in there and you get scum in the tank. And apparently the water and the scum floats on top of the fuel. And all week we were fine, but as the fuel level went down, Friday I hadn't put any fuel in it. Dale goes out there with his family the past 2 years on Friday and has a lot of fun, and all of a sudden it starts cutting out.
Yeah.
And when the gas gets so low, I think it starts sucking the water and the gunk.
Yeah.
So this year, to avoid that, I went in the middle of the week and filled it up again.
Okay.
So it's still got it, and I kind of hate that because there's a half tank gas in here.
Yeah.
And if nobody uses it, the gas won't be that good next year.